thank you very much. It's great to be here. Really appreciate the opportunity. And just want to introduce myself and then Will real quick. I teach architecture at Virginia Tech. I do historic preservation, adaptive reuse, and which is one of the ways I got to meet Will.
Yep. So I'm Will Rourke, and I want to thank everybody for having us here today. This is really great. First of all, I'm with the Fluvanna Historical Society, so it's very nice to be here in Orange, and I hope I get to meet some of you in the Historical Society here. I am with UVA. I'm officially with the UVA Library. I've been with UVA for 28 years, and I've been doing what I'm going to show a little later, at least since 2011. I'm also faculty in architectural history, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about how architectural history at UVA integrated with Brian's project, who has a legacy at UVA as well.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I don't bring that up at Tech all that often.
Hey, I went there.
And they introduced me when I started. I'm pretty sure I got booed. So how many folks have been to Barboursville? Easy question. How many folks have had Barboursville wine? Even better question. How many folks have had Barboursville wine before this talk? I love you all. You are my people. Thank you. So really excited to show you some of the work we've been doing out there. And a lot of this began with, I'm also on the board of the Center for Palladian Studies in America, which has sponsored this. And I want to show you this. Ways of looking at Barboursville, ways of imagining buildings that have changed over time. And one of the complexities with Barboursville is that we have a design that's really not quite what was built, and what was built burned and became a ruin and has since become other things. It's a really interesting multi-layered history. But it starts with this. This is a really peculiar portrait. This is a portrait of James Barbour. James Barbour's name is not on it anywhere, and I'll show you why we think it's James Barbour. Turned up for an auction about 12 years ago now. It was consigned to an auction house in New Orleans. Not much was known about it, that the owner of it who was consigning it was a collector. Had a good eye, and just liked pretty things. What's peculiar about this portrait is that we know from the Cephas Thompson was the painter. We know from his notebooks that Barbour sat for him for a portrait in 1810. No one ever saw it. It was presumed to have been in the house when the house burned in 1884, and that was the end of it. But it wasn't the end of it. And the even more peculiar thing is this thing over Mr. Barbour's left shoulder. It might at first appear when you look at that, oh, it's a little building out a window, right? It kind of looks like that. That's not a window, and that's not a building outside a window. That's an architectural drawing that's tacked up on that wall. And if you look closely at it, you see it on your right. You can see it's drawn as though it's India ink on paper, and like India ink washes. It's not a building, it's a drawing of a building. So what this indicates is this is something that Barbour didn't yet possess, but he wanted. He had a drawing for it. He had an idea for a building. And this is what happens when you fill in the missing 3/5 of the drawing. It's a fairly interesting, compelling building. And it starts to fit into a pattern, which we'll talk about. And so, is this the sequence? Is this some sort of an earlier version of about 1810? In the center, I show you Jefferson's drawing of it in 1817, which is what was actually built. And then we have the issue of confronting the building as it was built, which you can see looks very different. This building has had a lot of lives. And this is one of the things that makes it so fascinating. Wow, to me anyway. And I hope to you too. So how do we know it's Barbour? Well, these are two, I'm bracketing it by two known images of Barbour. An engraving from 1808, just 2 years earlier, and then a portrait from 1822. Luckily, Mr. Barbour's rather distinctive nose did not change shape at any point in his adult life, nor did his very distinctive forehead and his widow's peak. And you can see his hairline is receded, as it does for all of us at some point. And he apparently owned one jacket and one carafe. So it clearly fits in this pattern. So even though it's not signed, we're pretty comfortable saying that's James Barbour. Now, you might think, oh, well, the painter, Cephas Thompson, put things in the background all the time. Actually, he didn't. This is a pretty typical Cephas Thompson portrait, right? You've got the sitter sitting at a 3/4 pose, neutral background. He's holding a book. Some of the sitters have something in their hands. But Thompson didn't often paint elaborate backgrounds. The only time you really see elaborate backgrounds in Thompson's work these are his children. When he did portraits that were different from commissions, it would be special commissions. Occasionally, people would be in some very fancy Greek dress, but they're by far the exceptions. And this is a very typical. This is very atypical. Then, so you even see that same brown background. It was in Charles Alden. It's the exact same thing, and he's showing you this drawing on it. So this is telling us something. This is something very, very intentional. So the question is then, who drew it? I'm going to show you here why I think it's an architect who drew it. It's not just something that Thompson made up and hung in the background. Very limited number of ways to become an architect in this period. In your late 18th, late 19th century, you generally had to learn from working for someone. This is the sum total of the known architecture schools that I've been able to find in the early 19th century. Extraordinarily rare. And most of these only operated for a season or two. These were really evening schools. The first School of Architecture as we know it was MIT in 1867. So we're way out ahead of that. So here's why I think it was an architect that drew it. On your left, you see the image from the background. And you can see one of the really distinctive things is the shadows are cast from upper left to lower right. It's a standard convention of architectural drawings at the time. It didn't matter what the actual building orientation was. Always upper left to lower right. And I show you, this is a detail of a column in the center of a base, a base in, this turned up in some of the drawings at UVA. And you can see someone's being taught how to do just that with watercolor. Someone's learning how to cast shadows on the drum of a column. And I'll show you on the right, a well-known drawing of a garden pavilion done by one of Jefferson's work with John Nielsen, who was one of the most skilled. Now, curious thing happens in Nielsen's garden drawing. Nielsen was entirely self-taught. One of the ways you can tell that is that he's casting his shadows from upper right to lower left. And that may not seem like much. But also look at this. So instead of doing smooth washes to show you shadows, he's drawing these tiny little lines together. What does this mean? He taught himself to draw from looking at lithographs, because that's how you make shadows in lithographs. You just draw tiny lines and make them closer and closer. So he is completely self-taught and doesn't know you're supposed to, he doesn't know because lithographs are reversed left to right. So when they're engraved, everything is printed opposite. He's copying what he thinks is the way someone should draw as an architect, but he doesn't know. He doesn't know the reversed. That's how we know this was done by somebody who was trained as an architect. It's highly likely that it was done by this man, Robert Mills, because Mills is in the right place, in the right time, with the right skill set. So in 1802, 1803, he spends some time with Jefferson at Monticello, with Jefferson giving him a series of drawing exercises to teach him how to draw. And Mills wasn't the only one that Jefferson taught like that. I showed you here a little bit of Thomas R. Blackburn, was another workman who answered a want ad to work at the University of Virginia as a carpenter. And through John Nielsen's help and through Thomas Jefferson's loan of books, became an architect. See, I took my 8 years of my dissertation and got it down to 30 seconds. It's kind of awesome. So he published this as a book. It's really fascinating because you watch him learning to become an architect. And he borrowed Jefferson's Palladio, which was an extraordinarily expensive book. No one had copies. There were only 2 copies in Virginia at the time. And he copied the pages out, moved all the text in, and then interestingly built on it. So this is years later when he's in Stanton. He's building an ionic portico, and then leaves his notes as to all the adjustments that he made based on Palladio. That he extended the column, made it a little bit taller because he thought the proportions looked better, left off the fluting. But he's really using that. Here he is, years later, he's still referring to it, still using that. It's exactly what Robert Mills did with Jefferson too. Except in Mills' case, Jefferson was actually giving him drawings of Monticello and other buildings to copy. So this is Mills' reworking of a Jefferson drawing. For many years, this was credited to Cornelia Jefferson Randolph, Jefferson's granddaughter. It's not. This is Robert Mills. And it's not a copy of any Jefferson drawing because he's playing with the proportions. He's making it a little taller. He's stretching things. He's trying to make his own improvements to it. This is another Mills exercise for a rotunda house. And what gets interesting about this one, if you look up in this, if you look here in the section, a section is when you take a building and you slice it and you push part of it away. It's the same thing when you make a plan. You make a plan by slicing through a building horizontally and looking down on it. You make a section by slicing through it vertically and looking at it straight on. And that's what you see here. If you look up in the dome, you see all these little dots. What all those little dots are showing you it's a plank dome. Made. This is from a book in 1561 by Philibert Delorme, telling you how to build a dome out of planks laminated together. This was Jefferson's favorite dome. It clearly came from Thomas Jefferson. The only examples known of this dome in the US come from people connected to Thomas Jefferson, period. There is no other way they got around. This is Philibert Delorme. And a few years later, in 1811, this is Robert Mills building one in Philadelphia. You know, so there are all these connections that keep coming back. And as we'll see momentarily, this is the exact dome that was drawn by Jefferson to be built at Barboursville. Architecturally, there are a great number of similarities between that funny building in the background and the sorts of things that Mills was doing. This is the County Records building. Everybody knows it as the fireproof building. But you can immediately see this sort of the similarity between this very simple planar architecture, very unornamented. Even the proportions are almost the same as that building. I mean, there's an unmistakable set of visual connections. So, why didn't the building get built? Why didn't this happen in 1810? Well, a couple big things happened. One was the Richmond Theater fire at Christmas 1811, which killed the governor, the lieutenant governor, several members of the House of Delegates. I think there were 200 people died in a city that I think had about 1,800 people at the time. It was an incredibly devastating occurrence. And in the wake of that, Barbour found himself governor. He was pushed up and elected by the General Assembly to become governor. So no time to build a new house. Shortly after he's elected from governor, the British invade. They're in Baltimore. They're in the U.S. They came to Norfolk. This pretty much consumes his entire time as governor and dealing with this crisis. So he's not building a house. So how does that house get built? So this is the drawing that eventually reemerges it's no later than 1816 because construction started in 1817 with explicit reference to this drawing. This is clearly Thomas Jefferson. It's a very interesting building, very simple, not a very big building. It's 5 bays wide, pretty simple. It's dominated by this dome, and you can see a lot of the standard Jefferson. Well, that's peculiar. So you can see especially how he's crunching the two windows in to make them look like they're, to reduce the apparent height of the elevation. That's something he was very fond of doing. In plan, it's a very simple building. We have, let's give this thing a shot again. All right, so you enter the building from north to south. This is come off the porch into a reception area. The main entertaining room is this octagonal space. Dining room here, principal bed chamber here, secondary chambers here and here. On the second floor, this stair takes you to only one room. There is no connection across. There's a stair that takes you here, a second stair over here that takes you to these two bedrooms. It's not a very big building. It's quite a simple building. There's some interesting details about the building. You can also see, if you look in Barbour's hand, you can see a piece of paper that's rolled up. When you look closely at that, it's an Ionic volute. And when you see in Jefferson specs, and again, this is written later, this is coming 7 years later, Jefferson writes, as if that same drawing were happening at that same moment, 2 cornices and both Ionic cornices in the building in these double height rooms. So the question is, did the design go from Mills to Jefferson, or did it start much earlier? This is an unidentified drawing in Jefferson's collection. It's been traditionally dated about 1800. So the dates, I wouldn't bet. I wouldn't bet Will's money on that date. The last time this drawing was dated was in 1912, so take that for a grain of salt. But it's an early version of something that looks remarkably like Barboursville. And he's taken the time and worked up the elevation of it in ink. And you can see the section is in pencil, and it's kind of unfinished. Because the problem is, he was working on this drawing and figured out that you can't get into this dome room. He's trying to make a dome room, and he realizes that there's no earthly way to get in there. And he gives it up, puts it away. So, is this the change? Did this start as a much earlier drawing in Jefferson's hand that he gave to Mills as an exercise to rework? And later, when Barbour finally returned to the US, had money and time, Barbour went to Jefferson to get the thing built. Does it have a longer history than that? Well, and then we have this problem. What happened when it got built? It looks pretty different, doesn't it? This building over here, this is a dependent building that was built before. This is where the family lived before Barboursville was built. And this is where they moved. They moved back into this after the house burned. And this is probably the reason why the house itself isn't very large, because I suspect all the kitchens and the supply rooms and all the back of house stuff stayed over there. The big thing that's missing, of course, there's no dome. And in one of the great acts of architectural cowardice, at the end of Jefferson's specifications for Barboursville, he ends with this sentence: "And the dome may be omitted altogether if desired." I think he chickened out a little bit. And it wasn't built. Other things that didn't happen, you can see the windows were put very close together in Jefferson's drawing. They're tremendously split out in the final building. In fact, they're so split out that the cornice had to be shortened because the window smashed up into it. The Chinese lattice rail is left off, which takes us to this, our only photograph of the building right before it, not long before it was burned. This couldn't have been very long. This is we're seeing this from the north elevation, and we see the building as it had evolved a little bit. You see there's an addition on this side, obviously an addition here. But we see a few other changes. We see that when Jefferson drew the building, the moldings were all architrave moldings applied on the outer face of every window opening. As built, they get tucked around inside in these thin little Greek Revival moldings. And you can see it here. You can see in the paint scarring, you can actually see the line from where the brush has dribbled paint under the inside of that brick. And this is a drawing of it on your right. And this is exactly what happened at Bremo, a very similar building built by Jefferson Workmen. You can see the same thing. The moldings get thin and they're tucked back in. Other things that we don't quite know how they were resolved. All the wood was charred in the building. So we have this remnant of the fireplace. So we can see what the mantelpiece looked like because the mantelpiece was attached before the wall was plastered, and then the wall was plastered up to it. And it's very similar to this drawing. This is a drawing that Thomas Blackburn made. This is very similar to most of the mantelpieces on the lawn at UVA. It's also very similar to one of the lower ones at Bremo. Again, I mentioned the cornice. We've looked and we've looked. We've put drones all around the edge. The complication is it's right. This is the upper bounds of the surviving brick. The wall's tumbled. We think we should be in a zone where we should be seeing some blocking for the cornice if it was ever installed. There's no evidence of it. So either it's higher on the wall than we thought, and that part of that's some of the wall that's crumbled in the fire, or it was just never built. Other things that were built that show up in this painting from it's about 1830. I don't really have a hard date on it. If you look in the background of the painting, which is pretty much this view, if you're looking straight through, we see evidence of 4 buildings. We can see this is the original farm road coming in, taking a curve and coming up into the ellipse. These are 3 domestic buildings and probably 1 agricultural building. This is probably one of the set of enslaved dwellings at the place. And it would have been right on the curve of the road. You can see the curve coming in right here. So this is the trace of the road coming right in here. And this is a creek. So it actually comes downhill, hits that curve. You would have actually seen it. which is pretty common in a lot of plantations. That a lot of people think enslaved workers were hidden. In fact, it's not true. A lot of the residences are put right in the front. It's one of the first things you encounter, and I'm pretty sure this is what we're seeing here. It's also they sit up on a man-made terraform, and so it's one of the things we're hoping to investigate very soon. And just in closing, one of the last changes pre-fire or post-fire, or just before the fire, so you can see Barboursville, you can see where the enslaved workers' housing is. Brownland is a really interesting house. Brownland is actually built by descendants of the enslaved community at Barboursville. They were buying land, parcels of land from Barboursville as Barboursville's fortunes declined. And by the time Barboursville burned, this house was standing. And the family still owns it. They still reside in it. And we've worked up drawings on it in the book. But I just mentioned this as part of the community that expands out from Barboursville. It's much more embedded. Now, what happened to the ruins? Well, it's Virginia, right? So Ivy took over. They were completely engulfed. This is a Francis Benjamin Johnson photograph, 1915, 1916. There's a building in there. It's a little hard to see sometimes. It wasn't for the columns. I'm not sure there'd be a lot to look for. And the building remained in that condition. The last barber lived there until about, and it was a descendant. Did not have the last name Barber. 1950, and the remainder of the furniture was sold at auction. The land was sold. It went through a series of private owners until it was purchased by what became the Barboursville Corporation, the Barboursville Winery, Barboursville Vineyards. And one of the first things they did was to contact Mario de Valmarana, who had recently started at the University of Virginia in the School of Architecture teaching preservation. Mario had recently come over from Italy. I think he knew the family before he came here. And the other important figure in this is Ben Howland, who I show you on the right. That's actually a photograph both of these photographs are at Barboursville. Ben Howland was a recently retired National Park Service landscape architect who came to University of Virginia to teach. This is back in the old days. There was this wonderful thing. If you had put in a certain number of years service in the federal government, you could take your last few years teaching in a state university, and they would do a salary swap. Of course, it made a lot of sense, which is why we don't do it anymore. But Ben came down and set up was very interested in preservation, and it was really sort of, in many ways, the prime mover of this project. So Ben's students was really they both started at the same time. Ben had his students out surveying the land. They produced some really interesting surveys, compiled the land records. Mario had students measuring the building itself, working on conditions assessments and drawings, and actually had, believe it or not, they actually used the students to clear all the ivy off, getting it to the state, which I'm told if I did that, it would be a career-ending maneuver. And so we actually have to pay people now. And this is just kind of in the middle of the project. And so this is one of the drawings which we just recently tracked down that was produced off of one of those surveys showing existing tree cover around the building. Students also did archaeology. Not quite sure who was the archaeologist giving them direction. It's a little unclear. But we've uncovered we found some of their notebooks this year, and got a sense. We don't know what happened to the artifacts. Would love to know. It'd be very interesting. You can see this is 1978. So this is pretty early in the project that they were in, trying to get a sense of what happened. As the project moved through, drawings were produced. Professionals were hired to do the actual work, and the strategy was generally to level the top of the walls, to get them reasonably level, and to get regular step downs. And on all the reasonably flat surfaces, there's a slate covering at the top with a slight angle to wash the water off, to get it off. And the places that couldn't be covered with slate, you can see a little bit lower in the image on your left, are covered with tar and pitch, to give kind of a hard surface to keep water from coming back in. There's some tie rods and things. There's also, if you're out there, if you look, any place, a lot of the windows had collapsed over the years, and they've been rebuilt. There's steel headers under them. Oh, curiously, there's pressure treated wood on each side of the steel. I'm not sure what that's all about. But there's steel in most of them. Any place that brick was put back in the building, it's recessed 3 inches. So if you see any place that the plane drops back a little bit, they were doing that to tell you this is new, this is repair. Also, there were at the time there were also a series of student drawing student studios at UVA in the graduate program designing. I think they were asked to where do we go here? There we go. Asked to design a vineyard. I think this was the vineyard processing didn't exist yet. They were still just planting at this point. There were just some agricultural buildings there, and I think they were trying to design a vineyard. Some of the designs were quite good, but it was really using all parts of the architecture school to try to come up with something. And you can see some of the tie rods, and they put the chimney. The only thing they did reconstruct were the chimneys, and they put the chimneys up to what they thought were their full height to try to give you a sense of how tall the building was. And this is really what the building looked like. You can see some of the recessed areas back here, where the brick was, where the fallen brick was replaced. But this is pretty much where it was left by about 1981. It's not that different from what it is now. So, and that brings us to the current project. And I'm going to swap spots with Will here for a second and just mention that a lot of folks have been involved. My great colleague, Patrick Thompson, helped build the first version of the model. One of my current students, or was a student, Jan, picked up the model and has done some work on it. You'll see some renders, some hand watercolors later by Pat McLean. But lots of folks and lots of people are working on this. And none more so than Will. And I will hand it off to you. Thanks, Brian.
And now for something completely different. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk very briefly about what I do at UVA. And then that will be within the context of this project specifically. And what I'm about to talk about, I don't think has ever been given so much context as beautifully as Brian has been doing right here. So this is very exciting for me. So I am, again, with the library at UVA, with the Scholars Lab, and we have a spatial technologies group that specializes in all forms of spatial technologies like GIS and 3D modeling. And I am going to show you some of the crazy, weird 3D stuff that I've been doing, at least for the past almost 15 years. But as I mentioned earlier, I've been with UVA for about 28 years, and I've been doing all sorts of different kinds of 3D work since that time, since the 90s. The work that I'm doing lately is centered around cultural heritage because we are at a World Heritage Site at UVA. The Academical Village, of course, is one of the World Heritage Sites paired along with Monticello. So there's a wealth of information there that surrounds us. And so I record a lot of that information, a lot of that historic physical information that I can then put into the library. And the way that I do that is I use this method of cultural heritage informatics. Informatics is pretty much the study of data. And what I'm doing is I'm collecting 3D data. I'm going to keep saying that word over and over and over because it's new. It's kind of new to a lot of people. It's not quite 3D modeling like we see in Hollywood or with most architectural offices, but it's a way of using technology, 3D technologies, to record an historic place or historic things, cultural heritage things, and then be able to get data that I can then put into the library. It's my role with the library, so that you can get your hands on it, or the world can get their hands on it and be able to do research. These are some of the tools that I use in my practice of cultural heritage informatics. The collecting of 3D data is the first step in informatics. And so I'm using 3D scanning technologies to be able to get 3D information of objects and places. And for this project, I'm mainly using the scanner that you see over there under archaeology and architecture. It's a terrestrial LiDAR. It's a laser scanner. It's a laser in a box. And wherever the laser hits an object in real space, it creates a point in 3D digital space. And so it's collecting billions of points of data that will actually measure the subject, whether it's a whole building or whether it's a part of a building or an architectural detail. That's what this machine is doing. And then I also use handheld scanners to do a lot more intensive scanning of artifacts. And I work with a lot of artifact collections. I work with a lot of archaeologists. I've worked a lot with Montpelier just down the road, with Monticello, and a dozen other places, not only here in Central Virginia, but also elsewhere. And so when I'm collecting data, the object is to be able to collect very precise data. We want to be able to record history as precisely as possible so that when you get that data, you have a very accurate representation of that historic subject. So I use laser scanners, but I also use cameras. There's a way of taking lots of photos of a subject and converting two-dimensional photos into 3D data. Okay, we've done this at Barboursville. I'm going to show you what we've done there. But you can pretty much take photos on the ground with a standard camera, or you can send a quadcopter up in the air, which is what's going on over here at the McCormick Observatory. And you can take tons of photos and then be able to recreate an entire site in 3D like we have with the observatory and many other places, mainly in Central Virginia. And again, I want to emphasize 3D data. This is a series of points, and I can measure between any 2 points of the data that we've collected to be able to get almost infinite dimensions of a place or a thing. And so we are working with information, with scaled dimensional information that can directly go into the hands of architects or into the hands of engineers. And then we have a record of that place and that thing. So emphasizing the numbers behind the 3D. Once we've collected the data, we have to process it. We have to put together multiple scans in order to create one comprehensive scan data set that represents the subject. And here we've scanned, of course, just about the entire academical village. There are a few pavilions that I still need to get, but we've scanned the entire rotunda. And that's using the kind of terrestrial LiDAR you're going to see in a minute that we used at Barboursville. But we're also scanning a lot of artifacts. This particular artifact that you see up here is from the Fralin Museum of Art. I've scanned a lot of their collections, their collection items there. And then down in the lower right over here, you can see the photogrammetry. I'm taking a whole bunch of photos and turning it into 3D. It's kind of magical. But the technology is extremely robust these days, so that you can get extremely high resolution data from just 2D photographs. Once I have that data, you can do anything with it. Then you can disseminate it out to the scholarly community via the library, which is what I do, and you can use it in a whole bunch of different ways. And that's what Brian's going to be talking about in a minute here. But we can use it in architectural CAD or building information modeling or BIM. We can put it up on the web. We can 3D print it. Being able to 3D print the details of history can be a powerful thing. I did a series of artifacts with Monticello. If you've ever been up to Mulberry Row, most of the artifacts that you see behind glass on Mulberry Row, I scanned them and printed them, and we had a artist from VCU paint them. To preserve the originals, because the originals were dissolving in these non-environmentally controlled display cases. So it's all in the purpose of trying to preserve cultural history, trying to preserve history. And then we can also pull it into virtual reality or augmented reality, and you can become immersed within a historic site. So where I work in the new Shannon Library, I have a brand new office there. We have a virtual reality lab that's open to the public, and I have a lot of historic data on our virtual reality machine, so you can go visit historic places. We've got a little bit of the rotunda there. We've got a little bit of UVA. We've got a little bit of historic sites, a lot of history from Fluvanna. Since I'm right down the road with the Historical Society, I do a lot of scanning and processing of historic sites there. And so you can go visit these places and become immersed in them and explore them for yourself. So why do I even do this? Well, we learned a great lesson in 1895 when the rotunda burned down, and we found that we didn't have a lot of information for the rotunda. And that just happened recently um, in France, and we saw a famous cathedral burned down, and we didn't have very many, very much information on Notre Dame as well. But fortunately, somebody had gone in and scanned all of that site, and so we have an historic record. Whether they're going to rebuild it historically or not, we have the record so that we understand where that building came from in time. And now we have a record of the current rotunda so we can understand where it is in this part of time. Because 100 years from now, we want to understand where this building came from, and hopefully it'll still be standing another 100 years. But that's why we do this. We are providing a record that helps us understand the places around us and their place in time at this point in time. And I take that information and I put it into the library. I archive it in different ways. I archive the data so that it'll be around 1,000 years from now using a dark archive like the Academic Preservation Trust or AP Trust. This is a repository that will take data and hold it and save it for the long term. And then I also take the data and I put it into our open access platform so that people can download it immediately. So you can go to Virgo, which is our search and discovery platform. You can find books, periodicals, and 3D data. And so you can download this 3D data and you can bring it into your own VR. You can go and 3D print it, or you can do all sorts of research with it, like Brian's going to show us. And then I teach this in architectural history through the program for historic preservation. Each semester, I take students out into the field and we scan a number of places. And then I teach them how to process the data so that they can use it for their own research. And we've been all over the place. We've been to Monticello, we've been to Montpelier, we went to Vicenza and started to scan the Villa La Rotonda. We've just been all over the place trying to create these data sets so that we have records, historic records. Okay, and that brings us to Barboursville. So in 2019, I think it was, 2019 we started on the Barboursville project, and I had the opportunity to start working with Brian on recording all of the history at Barboursville to help his research. And we went back on 3 different occasions with different groups of students and collected information. And so here we started at the ruins, started right with the most mysteriously architectural site there is there, and started with the ruins. And so the students each got scanners and they went and all over the site and recorded the building in 3D. And when they're recording it, they have to record all the positions down. So we're working directly with the plans of the site in order to understand where the data was taken so that we can process it all together and create a comprehensive set of data. And so these are 3D renderings from the data. Once it's been processed, we have a full record of the entire site. And of course, we're focused on the ruins at that point, but you get a lot more data than you ask for when you're using 3D scanners, because it's scanning everything within a 360, about 30-meter radius. And so we have a lot of data. We're starting to get data of the dependencies at this point. We have data of not only the building, but the landscape, which is just as important as the building to understand the whole context of the history of the building. And then we went back and scanned the exterior of the dependencies. The dependencies, of course, are very expensive B&Bs, and we were on the inside, but the idea was to be able to record the landscape in the exterior of the dependencies. So we scanned around the buildings, but we also scanned the gardens in the back, and enough information to be able to join everything together in one data set with the ruins. And then this is the data that we collected there. Yeah, here we go. This shows you the extent of the data that we collected. And really, the building's right here, and so we got a lot more data than we asked for, which is what you expect when you're scanning sites like this. And over here, you can see that we got some of the ruins as well, so that we can join this data set with the data set of the ruins and create one comprehensive data set. We also went back and we were interested in, Brian was very interested in the landscape to the north, particularly the oval and some of the adjoining terraces, I think to the east. And so I got my colleague in landscape architecture to come out and help us. Michael Lugerine, who is a licensed drone pilot, and we flew, I don't know, quite a few acres that we were then able to take all of those photos and create a terrain model out of all of that information that we could then connect to the scan data. So we have a much larger area to work with here. And the idea, though, is to go back at some point and work on the site that Brian was showing you earlier, where he thinks that the enslaved dwellings once existed to the north. And we'll probably take everything with us. We'll do LiDAR, we'll do aerial photo for photography, for photogrammetry. And then we're also starting to work with some GPS now. I have GPS so that we can actually look under the ground. So with scanning, we're scanning just the surface. With GPR, ground penetrating radar, we can see under the surface and see what might be down in there. And I'm going to give it back to Brian.
So what do we do with all this? Well, this is where it gets really fun. So this is one of the this is part of that white scan model, which is actually a combination of pings essentially and visual photograph kind of mosaicked in, so you can see it more clearly. So this is another cut. We made a horizontal cut through the building. But if you look closely at it, you can see all sorts of interesting things. You can see every one of these pockets is a floor joist. You can see right above them these little puts like that. That's where your baseboards were attached. This is a chair rail. It tells us there was a chair rail running across here. Here's your stair structure. There's your handrail. Same thing, repeat up top. Amazing amounts of information that you can pull out of these things at any time that you need them. So one of the things that we did with them was our interest is trying to reconstruct a model and try to build this model of what did Barboursville look like? Barboursville as it was designed, as it was supposed to look, Barboursville as it ended up being built, and then Barboursville as it changed over time. So here's one of the early passes we made at trying to build a building, taking that model, taking that scan data from Will and starting to put a building on it and start to filling in the missing pieces. And we ended up changing our work protocol a little bit. And we decided it was actually easier for us to do it, go back in 2 dimensions and do all of our elevations in 2 dimensions and then bring those 2 dimensions back into 3 dimensions. So I show you here, this is Pat McLean is a terrific architect. And you can see what we have done with that. And one of the curious things you'll notice when you look at the building from the side is, of course, it's not symmetrical. You know, you'd expect a little more symmetrical elevation. You also see this is the window. This is the dining room here. Remember, this is a double-story space. There was no window there, and nor was there at the front. Now, Jefferson cheated a little bit and didn't draw these side elevations. They're peculiar. He didn't draw the side elevations, and he did not draw the north elevation. So we had a lot of interpolation to do to try to interpret. So we're going back to Jefferson's drawings, back and forth into the model, and back and forth into the scan data, and continually back and forth to figure out what are we trying to build. This is our 2D drawings of the building as it was built. You see, of course, there's no dome. There is no window over the dining room. You can see the windows are spread out much further. One of the issues we had is right here. Remember how Jefferson drew those windows very close together? The second floor window was actually down below the floor joist. It was so far off in his drawing. So we had to make a bunch of changes to make it possible. But this is what we determined was the as it was built. And this is what we determined over time. We're still tweaking this a little bit, how the building evolved over time with the two wings on the side. Um, um, and I should say, when you had mentioned the photogrammetry, I just found 2 weeks ago, occasionally a landscape architect who's now a practicing landscape architect, who was a student in this class, let me know that he had a box of material I could look through. And it included photogrammetry done in 1977 by the Park Service. So it'll be fun to go back to those. And it's all getting scanned now. I don't have them yet because they're not in here, but it's one of the earlier attempts at photogrammetry. Um, and this is how we started to take those two-dimensional drawings and then push that data back into a three-dimensional model. And this is just some screenshots as we were doing it. But it forced us to confront a lot of things. One of the interesting things about coupling scanning with now creating a full three-dimensional model is the amount of physical interpretation that you have to do. For example, I show this as an example. This is Jefferson's drawing of the rotunda. This is the building that he probably thought about and fussed about more than any other drawing in his life. This was his dream, was to put a library at the head of the lawn at UVA. This is one of the most meaningful drawings that he ever created. This is how he drew the Capitol. You can't build that. This is just a note. This is an indication of desire. This is an indication. You have to look up what plate and Palladio did he mean to use. But this is what I mean, that Jefferson's drawings are suggestions. They're not what we think of today as an architectural drawing that you would go out and build. They're ideas, but we have to do a lot of reverse engineering and a lot of interpretation to make them work. And I just highlight a few areas on the drawings of things that we had to reinterpret to make the building work. For example, he obviously didn't understand the topography and thought it was a level site. It's not. The windows are crashing together, which I had mentioned before. Other things that are interesting, like in his drawing, he draws the chimney coming up through the structure of the dome. Well, you can't do that. So we cheated in our model a little bit, and we cantilevered the dome out a little bit, the chimney out a little bit to get it clear of the dome structure. His lunette window is entirely too large. You couldn't build it. It's actually crashing into the pediment. It's so large. We have the same issue with the capitals, or just the nearest suggestion of what a capital might look like, and other places where there's just clear errors, where the lattice drawing is not only drawn, there's no dimensions to it, it's just kind of dotted in, but it's just hanging out over the edge of the building. And the other thing is Jefferson was right-handed, so he drew from left to right so he wouldn't smear on the page, and his dimensions string out as you go to the right-hand side. So everything over here on the right-hand side of the drawing is about a foot off. So all kinds of things like that are happening. So we can't take these things literally. So when we come up with a drawing like there's a lot of hand interpretation that goes into it. And we also, this is some work that Pat's been working on, did a series of hand drawings and hand sketches, and again, to try to study the building and to see it in different ways. And and using watercolor to get a shade and shadow sense. And this is a tone study to try to get a sense of how other ways of looking. So we're using all of these different techniques, some very old, some very new, all at the same time to try to tell this story. And just briefly, I show you here. This is our reconstruction of what the building as built looked like. And of course, we have that horrible problem of there's no window there, and it's exactly as awkward as it looked. And so we recorded it that way. But current work going on right now. My current studio this semester has been doing a project in the ruins, and I don't have much to show you yet of theirs. Their semester ends on December 19th, and I'll have a lot to show you on the 19th. But answering these same questions, what can we do with the ruin? How do we interpret this? How can we inhabit this? And I'll show you just the beginnings. This is some of the model that we created. This is our 3D model of the building, showing from different aspects, and we can cut it, slice it, move it open, and so have students in all parts of this building. Actually, they've modeled the dependency now, and model all the model the topography, and so lots of it's a dynamic living thing. And so this is all going to be kind of worked into the book in terms of ways of knowing things, and really how are the many how are all the different ways you can understand a building through time, and how can we use the scan data? How can we use these our new ways of looking and couple them with old ways of looking? And and again, to go back to the beginning and ask ourselves, what are we seeing, and what is the story? Where did the design of the building go? We have that whole history of the history of, is it a design did it start with Robert Mills, or did it start with Jefferson and go to Mills and back to Jefferson? And then we have the problem of what happened in construction. We have the problem of here are three very different visions of what that building would look like. There's Mills's vision, there's Jefferson's vision, and then there's what happened in construction. Each of these things tells us something very important about it. And then we have the building, again, that full evolution of the building over time. How did it get built? What happened to it in its lifetime? And what can the ruin now tell us? What can we test? What can we tease out of that ruin? And, and all the different technologies that we can use. These are, are we using two-dimensional drawings, watercolors, using three-dimensional information to try to capture buildings and landscapes, and then to build a three-dimensional building that we can then inhabit and move around in, all to tell the story of how that drawing got to be this building. Thank you very much. And I'd be happy to answer any questions. Yes, please.
In the portrait of Barbara that you showed early on, the schematic that was behind him on the wall, what's the significance, if any, of there only being half a schematic?
Yeah, I'll go back to that real quick. Yeah, so the question is, why are we just seeing part of it? Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. I don't know if if it was just a simple problem of how to fit it in the frame in a way that you could get enough of a sense of the design. If you squash the whole thing in, it would have been pretty small. It may have just been a compositional question, because certainly, yeah, and that's a really good point. So no one would create an architectural drawing that's 2/5 of an elevation. So it's obviously an interpretation of that drawing, but it is curious. It's not small, and it's not all the way across behind him. I suspect we would have lost him. Unfortunately, the tone of his skin is almost exactly the same tone of the drawing. And so I think if the drawing were behind him, he'd disappear. But yeah, that is a good point. That is curious. But I think I think it's a totem. He's trying to say this is coming. Yes, sir. And then ma'am.
You're doing the study of the ruins of the outbuilding. What, if anything, you're doing about the land that I believe was sold off for the town itself?
Yeah, it's a good question. So trying to accumulate the land records and to try to get a sense of when the Barbour land records are, what's the polite word? They're a mess. Ann Miller's been really helpful with that. I mean, they're really difficult. The family was selling off tiny little parcels, and the Barbour account books are just a nightmare to go through. I mean, everybody kept ledgers of things, and this is before double ledger accounting, when you would basically have to come up with some system of keeping track of what was paid and what was owed. It looks like their system was to take every account, slice it out of the book into tiny little slips of paper, and then create piles of what was owed and what was paid. And so when you go in some of their years, it's just hundreds and hundreds of little slips. And so a lot of the land transactions are in some of those. A lot of the construction stuff is in some of those. They had a lot of land holdings in Florida, and everything is just kind of but it is important. And we're trying to show, how that land got down to the core that's there. It's been a challenge, but it's an important part of the story. It's very important. So, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
When they started to stabilize the ruins in the 70s, you mentioned that the archaeological artifacts, we kind of lost touch with them. Was there anything that you still had account of, and what can you just give us some more information about that?
Yeah, so what we know about what happened it's been curious. So all of Ben, and Ben was a Marine, so he kept great files. Everything was organized, and when he retired, everything went to special collections at UVA. So we have a really good sense of what went through Ben Howland's hands. Mario was one. I was one of Mario's TAs. Mario was not very organized, and so at the end of every semester, Mario would kind of sweep things into folders, and they would go into boxes. But luckily, he gave that box of materials to Barboursville. And so Barboursville loaned that box to me. So I have all of Mario's stuff. And that's where the archaeology turned up. There were the notebooks that the students kept and some photographs that I showed a couple. So luckily Mario gave all that to Barboursville. So we kind of put the two together. And plus, I've been talking to some folks that were in that class that are still practicing landscape architecture with another set of documents. And so sometimes I'll see the draft once, so I know that something exists, and then we can go out and find it, somewhere else. And the archaeology has been a particular challenge because that was sort of anything that had to do with landscape was really Ben's. Anything that had to do with architecture and preservation was Mario's. The archaeology was someone else. And whoever that someone else is, they never bothered to write down that person's name. So the only name that's come up associated with it, I found Ben kept the most amazing meeting minutes. And so Bill Kelso showed up to some meetings early on. And so it could have easily have been Bill, having kind of telling them what to do. And that's my only guess because there's no other name. And what happened to the boxes of things that they pulled out? I don't know. We can't find them. And it's possible they're around Barboursville somewhere. It's always the problem with archaeological collections and architectural drawings is they're big and awkward and they don't fit in drawers. They don't fit in a filing cabinet. And if it doesn't fit in a filing cabinet, drawings just get flung into attics and into closets. And you find more of them that way than anything else because they're long and skinny and they don't fit. Archaeological stuff tends to drift down to the basement or the garage. And so it's entirely possible that there are some boxes sort of stored away in one of the agricultural buildings out there. I just don't know. Just haven't seen them yet.
Have you worked with Luca Pasquina at all about it?
Luke has been great. Yeah, no, Luke has been wonderful. He was the one who loaned us the box of all the stuff that they found there that came out of Mario's. I mean, couldn't be more open and accessible. That's something that just hasn't turned up yet. Yeah, because basically what you're looking, you can see the boxes in the pictures. They're old liquor boxes. So you have any old liquor boxes with some rocks in them? It's not a great cue for a search. But you never know. I mean,
threw those into the creek years ago.
Yeah, I mean, we tried to find years ago working on a courthouse project, and we'd found some of the original drawings, but the elevation was missing, and people steal those a lot and frame them and hang them up. So I had one of my young architects, we just did a sketch of what it would look like and just go knock on doors and show this. Say, have you seen this? And it worked. So I'm like, oh yeah, always come back, follow me. And so, you never know. I mean, sometimes it's just too much work to totally destroy that final act in there. But hopefully it would be nice to know because the notes aren't terribly clear about, there are notes like, oh, lots of fire damaged metal. Well, okay, that could be any number of things. And, and these were students that were doing it for the very first time. And so the descriptions have sometimes you have descriptions with lots of words that don't say a whole lot. And that's I think this was sort of one of the few professions that didn't have a full-time body attached to it as a part of the project. So hopefully will. Yes, ma'am.
What came to my mind while you were doing the talk is a topic you're not, obviously haven't had to do with. Scotland Park. These dome homes at Jefferson. That was obviously his concept. And that's a dome building that's had a whole lot of work done and completed on it. Is that related in any way to this Barboursville building?
I mean, there are obviously some parallels to it. The closer parallels seem to be, somewhat with the Monticello Dome, just because of the proximity and the workmen. When the workmen were hired, they were invited by Jefferson to go to Monticello and look at the dome. And so they did go and look at that one. And maybe it was at that point they decided that this is not going to happen. Because the Monticello dome is even weirder because it's actually not circular. It's actually slightly ovoid. And so you can imagine the carpentry involved in making a wooden dome now, where the beauty of the Delorme system is that it's basically a kit of parts. Everything in each ring is the same. Not when you make it an oval. But
Is that just the roof that's that way, or the whole building?
no, it's the dome, and it's because you can kind of see the problem at Barboursville where the dome is really far forward. Part of the way Jefferson tried to address that is by stretching it a little bit. Not recommended for use at home. Yeah, it's really interesting. But there are some connections. Like I would with that one, the Poplar Forest is a little funny in that Jefferson really wasn't there during construction, and a lot of funny things happen in construction at Poplar Forest because he basically tried to manage it by writing letters. He would write the workmen very detailed letters and tell them what to do. And they quickly learned that if they wanted to keep Jefferson off his back, they would just write back and just say they had done everything. And but it's a little different. He wasn't there personally, and I think that's the difference when he got to Monticello, which obviously was his own house. That he's much more closely involved, and I think that was probably the vision for this: is a much more closer involvement with it.
So the dome at ruins is circular.
Yeah, it would have been a circular dome on an octagonal drum, and we've gone back and forth on that more times than I can count. About was the dome octagonal, was it circular, was it in sections, or was it just circular? We've gone back and forth and back. There's ambiguous evidence, and we've drawn it as octagonal. But I think in the week since we've drawn it, I think we've regrettably decided it was probably round, and so we're going to have to back up and make that adjustment. I don't think it was, and I think it's more of a construction. The more we were starting to lay it out, so we've actually built the dome in 3 dimensions, that Delorme dome, and as we were building that, we kind of realized that it's much more complicated building it in sections than building it circular, which is not what I expected. And that's probably, in most of the Delorme domes that got built were circular. Not that many, but they were mostly circular for that reason. So I think we're going to have to go back and tweak it. So this will become circular. The drum will be octagonal, and the steps will be octagonal, but the actual dome itself will be circular. That was an unhappy conversation. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
Yes. So I take it the problem with them putting a dome on it was technical and not financial, or was it a little bit of both?
We don't know. There's actually no correspondence about why they made that decision. None at all. One would assume it was financial. Jefferson wrote about this dome all the time. Nothing could be easier or more economical to build. But that was written by the man who was so massively, deeply in debt at his death that he didn't even know it. And so they were difficult to build. They were time consuming. And no matter what he said, there's no planet on which a gable roof is cheaper than a gable roof is more expensive than a dome. So I presume that's the reason, that it was a combination of technical skill and money. Because we know the 2 workmen that we know were hired had never done a dome before, and surely going to look at this thing in person, and they would have picked up on the fact that it's not quite round and pushed out, and would have like, oh my God, that's all we can assume. And at a certain point, the Barbers are like a lot of, they're land rich and slightly cash poor, so it's not a big house, and it's not finished. There are only 2 rooms that were going to have interior cornices in them. And it's not clear they were ever built. So it's a farmhouse in a lot of ways. Yes, ma'am.
When was the Rotunda Dome built?
So the Rotunda Dome is the last thing built at UVA. So construction on the Rotunda starts in 1826. It starts coming up out of the ground.
Yeah.
Is that about right?
For the Rotunda.
For the Rotunda, yeah.
I think in 1829.
Yeah, and then it takes them about 3 years to get up
Yeah.
to that level. So 26 is when it's the big shift in Charlottesville where all the other work is done and a lot of the workmen start to scatter and the rotunda is the last thing. So I think, yeah, 26 it starts, probably 28, 29, they're getting into the structure of that. So it's long after this one. And I think he may have still been paying for this one. But. Yes, sir.
Can you talk a little bit more about the convergence of the technologies around penetrating the flight good Scott, as you alluded to, in terms of how that affects your work and how it would affect the future use of these new technologies?
Yeah, so with the 3D laser scanning, at least we have a record that we can go back to. And the record that we have is the bare bones, and it's enough to be able to send students in there and be very creative with the research that's been found. So you have that record. With GPR, though, especially at the site that we're looking at to the north, there's just not a lot above ground to see what's going on at all. And if we can, we would use GPR to give us some ideas of where archaeology should probably take place. Because GPR, ground penetrating radar, doesn't give you results that are quite as communicative as 3D laser scanning. 3D laser scanning, you're scanning at millimeter resolution. With GPR, you're just getting sort of an idea of what could be down there. And then start digging. So at least that might give us an idea if those four structures are there. And then you have a record of that as well that can go into the library. And then with the aerial, that gives us a full landscape. That's not going to give you the accuracy of LiDAR on the ground, but it will give you a much bigger idea of what's going on the ground at that time. And then again, you can build historic, theories over what's could have occupied those places in the landscape once you have a really good landscape model. And again, applying that to this site that we're taking a look at to the north, if we can combine all of these types of information together, it can give us a really good idea of where we can do more intensive investigation using archaeology. I think archaeology is going to really give us the definitive answer.
And another place these line up really interesting, we didn't show it obviously because we just didn't have the time, is the garden to the east of the building. You have these terraces coming down, a garden that was enclosed with a serpentine wall. That's great for that. So we used actually some of that scan data and have started to build sections down through that to try to reconstruct what that might have looked like. And that's another really interesting place where, when you're there on the ground now, it's so consumed by those boxwoods. And remember, those boxwoods are not historic. They ran a boxwood farm there, and so they were planting them on the terraces because they were nice flat spots, not because they were there's anything historic about that pattern. And so you can't see it. You have to really walk in them to try to, but using these scans, using LiDAR, and using this combination and then interpreting it, we can really show this really magnificent feature that now on the ground is not terribly legible.
Yeah, I mean, all these technologies fall under the term of remote sensing. And so we're able to sense these things from a distance, but be able to find out more from all of them together.
And it's a preservation tool. So it allows us to, we're digitally 86ing all of those boxwoods without ever cutting them down. We're doing these reconstructions of the building without messing with the ruins. The ruins are left alone. So it's become a really interesting place to do preservation experimentation. So, sometimes not every building needs to be built. Sometimes, a digital idea is all you really need to understand something.
Actually, I want to go back to Poplar Forest real quick, because there was one of the drawings you showed earlier looked like it came directly from Villa Rotunda. And Poplar Forest is supposed to be half scale Villa Rotunda. And that could be a direct influence here. And we can find out because I had the data for Villa Rotunda. I had the data for Poplar Forest as we scanned all of that. And we could fit that over top of these ruins and see if there's any sort of similarity or directions that could point to that. So That's nice to have
Yeah,
that in my mind
yeah,
now.
I actually have always understood that flat area to the north that you're talking about was a racetrack. Is there any evidence to support that?
Want me to get that one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Talk about the oval.
Yeah, so this is what the oval feature to the north of the building, which is almost exactly the same as the oval at Monticello. It's not a racetrack. There's a watercolor with some horses on it. The difference is, and I know this from Will Riley. All I know about horses are they're tall and they're pretty. I don't know any of the horses. But that horse racing at this time was point-to-point racing. These were Arabians. They were going distance, and more like a steeplechase than they weren't going around a track. The horses that ran on tracks, quarter horses, hadn't been bred yet. A stallion a big Arabian would just kind of fall over trying to do one of these tight loops. They're not sprinters in the same way, and so these would have been. So there's no doubt that there could have been point-to-point races starting from that location. But the idea that this was a track, plus it's not that big. It's a pretty tight, So, and most of this comes from there is a watercolor where you see a jockey and a horse out there, and I didn't show it only because it's problematic in a couple of ways. But no, they weren't.
Nothing flat, but in Barboursville.
No.
That field is flat.
No, it's a great point. No, it's sort of relatively level. I didn't show we've done a reconstruction of it. It's still slightly domed. It's not a, so it's kind of an oval. Which so if you're accelerated around the edge of it, it's all your centripetal force throwing you down the side. It's terrible. You would not want to race a horse on this, unless you really didn't want the horse back. But it's a story that kind of attaches itself to Barboursville, and it's a tough one to shake.
It's a landscape feature, though.
Oh, it's definitely a
An
design
oval, yeah.
landscape feature. No question. One of the things I'm hoping we can do with a little archaeology is start to determine how much of that was shaped. We have to trench it and look for disturbance. Like how much of that is cut and leveled. Because I wish I hadn't cut it out. I pulled it out for time. But there's a similar oval actually to the south. Another designed oval you would have seen, because that was really the primary view out of the building, was looking the other way. And that's why the octagon is facing in that direction. And there's another leveled oval on top of a hill. And I don't know if is that a natural feature, or is that shaped too? But yeah, no question that's a shaped feature. There's nothing. Surely there's some natural topography in there that leads to that, but it's not. It didn't just start like that. And it's also like Monticello in the sense that you never approach the house axially. You never see the house on axis. You sort of come up the side of the oval, and you kind of rise up, and then get onto the oval about 2/3 of the way down. And so your first glimpse of the house is off at an angle. It's really lovely. It's really, really interesting. But it's not. At no point can you ever approach that house on axis. Yes, sir.
When in the era of Lancelot Brown was this residence park of Barboursville created? Was there any possibility that Brown had anything to do with this?
I'm not aware of him ever doing anything in the U.S., but I think there's a great deal. Let me see if I can find that image real quick. So there's a lot of it is about sort of glimpses, and that's a lot of what was happening in picturesque landscape design at this time. That you'd catch something at a distance, and then you'd move away from it, and then you would move a little further, you'd see it at another angle, and that's very much how the approach to this works. So if you come down Old Mansion Road, you would start moving, you turn to the left, and as you turn to the left, you see the enslaved workers' housing. You go down the hill, it moves out of your sight, you go over the creek, then you start your way back up that road and climbing, and there you see the house. And then you start to climb up along the oval and move in. So it's about these sort of glimpses and angles from different angles and different perspectives as you're moving. It's not this sort of axial symmetry where you jump, there's the house, and I just get closer to it with every step. It's and that's pretty typical of the way Monticello works. I think to a lesser extent, poplar forest, it's just a smaller piece of land. But it's pretty common on a lot of larger places that kind of a picturesque way of seeing things in the distance. And like I say, it was fully intentional that you would have seen the enslaved workers' house. You wouldn't be that far from it, but not for long, and then you turn, and we think of that long oval. So the crazy thing about that oval is at the end of the oval, there's nothing. There was never a pavilion out there. There wasn't a viewing platform, because that's not how the intent wasn't to walk out straight back and look at the house in a straight line. It was always to look at it from the side and to see glimpses here and there. Yes, sir.
Speaking of comparative in terms of Montpelier, the more you bring up landscape, I mean, there's a lot of similarities there. Barbara and Madison are, 10 miles away from each other, probably in their retirement, discussing his house being built after I just built mine, Madison to Barbara. But then in terms of comparative with the architecture, in terms of data sets, in terms of what you found within Barboursville and what Chad Keller and Worthy Martin and others, has there been any comparison or?
Not that I know of with Montpelier. I didn't do the scanning at Montpelier proper because it had already been scanned. I scanned a lot of the archaeology there, and I worked mainly with Matt.
Well, I'm talking about like the early restoration scanning. That would be
We
two decades ago.
we have the 3D model, and it's a series of models because it was built in phases since Madison's father built the original house there.
What was interesting was in that window, and that being a later edition at Montpelier, because the portico was put up in the 1790s version when we added the wings, which was Denmark Nielsen. Then that's when they think that Lunette went up, which would then even probably post-dates the wings, and it kind of corresponds with the Barboursville construction. Are the workmen Dinsmore and Nielsen on this one too, or no?
No. Although the drawing that shows that from Montpelier turned up in Thomas Blackburn's notebook. It's a small world.
Yeah.
Yeah. But no, they did not, because with that date, they were still very busy at 16, 17. It's just peak construction at UVA on the pavilions. I mean, I
did have I'm at the Historical Society in Charlottesville. I did have a Garth family business ledger that came in this year, and has Dinsmore Nielsen. It's got Hugh Chisholm, the brick.
Really?
And it's a brief period of time, but it actually shows when, I can't remember, I think it was Nielsen moved from Charlottesville to Greenville. It has the credit in the ledger of how much that expense was to move him there.
Oh, wow.
Building Upper Greenville.
Oh, I'd love to see that.
Yeah, come on by.
Oh, that's great. But yeah, so there's a lot of overlap. And then what happens kind of as you approach 26, the crews thin out, and only a very small crew, it's only the crew that continues on with the rotunda. And you see a great dispersal. You see a lot of workmen planning on leaving at that time. Also because if they all stayed in Charlottesville, they're just fiercely competing over things. And it's like 26 is the first time you see Blackburn does his own he designed the farm in Charlottesville. It's the first independent thing that he did.
Yeah.
It's 26. Everybody's kind of scattering at this point, and the competition's brutal. And so a lot of them move. I mean, Missouri, they're all scattering. And even Dinsmore and Nielsen are planning. I think they're planning on moving on. Now, they don't live that long. But my suspicion is, like, even the great watercolor that Nielsen did of the lawn, I think he's making a portfolio. I think he's planning on leaving. I think he's taking a record with him of what he did. I don't think he was planning on sticking around. But that's just my,
But just back to the landscape, I know Matt Reeves at Montpelier got LiDAR, and he has been looking at that constantly, trying to find circles and ovals.
Oh, yeah.
All across that. So in terms of a comparison between those two landscapes, it would be really interesting.
Yeah, we could totally do that. He had a private flyover, so he got really very precise data that he's been able to integrate into his GIS.
Yeah.
And I think that would be kind of a next step. getting some of this stuff, the terrain data into GIS would be a good idea.
I saw a hand up at back that I'm sorry. Let me pass it. Yes, sir.
What's the story on the little room that was on the right end of the building?
Oh, the additions up above.
No, it was a single story room that shows up in some of the photographs
Mhm.
that is no longer there.
So this is interesting. So we're looking. Remember, we're looking from the north. We're looking to the north. So this is on the side of the building facing towards the dependency. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, and so there was an addition on both sides, and they both go through a ton of evolution. They start with a door, a landing, and a stair, and they change. Each of them ends up with these sort of large. And it could have been. They could. This one could have started as a porch, and then got enclosed. But it would have been a really wonderful view. This is sort of looking down at the dependency, and it's really also looking at that feature that's to the south, is sort of another hilltop that's kind of flattened with an oval. Really dramatic view. Whereas this one on this side, this one I think would have been the best view in the place. So this one looked east down over into the terrace garden. Right. So I think they're just because the house is really built around the idea with the dome being on the other side of looking at. So this is looking at the oval, but you can't sit in this room. This is a reception room, which is kind of curious. So there's nothing about that view to the oval that's important to the design. So this is a reception room, and these are two bed chambers. So there's really no view, that the oval isn't the view. The view is on the other side, looking south, into that valley, and then that next oval. That's why all the principal rooms are on the other side. So I think you're seeing these things come on the west and east to take advantage of those views that you can't see, to get more of that southeast and southwestern views, which are really lovely, which are hard to get in the house. There's really only one spot. I think that's what they're doing.
But they've obviously been removed.
Yeah, and then they burn, and then all this got consumed. When you look at the building, you can see the remnants of. So you look at the building now, you can see the plaster ghosting because at some point they were fully enclosed. Does that help?
Yeah. And has there ever been any serious consideration to restore it?
To bringing the ruins back to an actual building? No. And I think part of the difference is, I think, and I'm only saying this is 45% in jest, is that if it would have been an American corporation that bought it, I think yes. I think we would have seen it reconstructed. But I think since it was in a part or removed, but I think we had an Italian corporation buy it, and I think they appreciate it for what it was. It didn't have to get worse, and it didn't have to get better. That it was just fine, and it was okay for it to get old. I think they appreciated it in ways that I think we're lucky.
But we were kind of told that they weren't, when they found out what it would cost to do it, they weren't convinced they were going to sell that much wine.
You know what? I'll ask. I will ask if there was ever a serious push at reconstructing it. Now, because none of the drawings they did, when the student projects were going, there's not a single reconstruction drawing. They're really just stabilizing what was there. That's not to say that it wasn't done, or certainly, I mean, come on, if it was mine, I would have talked about it. That's interesting. I will ask around if there are any memories of that.
Hey, it's like rooms. So.
Yeah.
Feel at home.
Yeah, I mean, it's lovely. It's
As it stands today, it is a monument to an era.
Yeah.
If you reconstruct it, it's just a building.
Yeah. And I think one of the great ironies is I think if this building were existing today, we would all go look at it and say, that doesn't look like Thomas Jefferson. And but you go to the ruin, and it's very Jeffersonian because all of the sort of non-Jeffersonian features burned off. So I think it looks more like a Jefferson building now than it ever did from the moment it came out of the ground. So, and then there would be that whole problem. Okay, you want to reconstruct it. So what are you going to reconstruct? What was planned or what was built? So we just did all of them digitally, and we don't have to make a choice. So, but that is why I think one of the great ironies, that it's more of a Jeffersonian building now I think he'd really struggle with this. Like, what is Jeffersonian about that? It's looks like a Stuteville,
They have
it's-
to change all their labels.
and that problem too. You don't want to have to. The labels are great. You don't want to have to rethink them. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Were there other detailed drawings, original drawings? Because I don't see a single dimension on any of
Nope. You are correct, sir.
them. That's it.
Yeah, that's it. And there were no 2 sheets. And the specifications have some dimensions in them. We're getting wall thicknesses, and which I will say turned out to be very accurate. So we were using the wall thicknesses when we were reconstructing it. We were using Jefferson's notes and kind of checking the thicknesses as we went. And I'll be darned if they're not.
They checked up with the scan data.
Yeah, they match the scan data.
That's what it's
Right there. And even the stepping as you go up, it matches. So we had some of that. And so he gives individual dimensions like window opening widths and heights and some door. Not all of them, but some of them. He doesn't give you anything for the side elevations, unfortunately. But yeah, the drawings are tough because there's just not that much,
kind of like the rotunda.
Yeah, like that rotunda thing. It's a suggestion. It's not what we would think of now as a set of detailed. Like you can't put a scale on that. We did, and you get all sorts of crazy numbers. It's not. And floors are in the wrong place. And
As
yeah.
far as you know, of the condition of the ruins, are they holding up? Do they foresee that they're going to be, they're secure? Because we've got acid rain that's dissolving the brick and all that stuff.
Sure. Yeah, one of the fascinating, jump in on this one, one of the fascinating things to me about the ruins is, so when a building loses its floors and roof, it's not just we think of the problem as letting in water, right? But it's more than that. Floors and roofs are diaphragms that tie verticals together and give it stability. So normally when you lose those diaphragms in a building, walls start to come destabilized, things start to shift and move. I've not found a single crack in this building that suggests any movement at all, new or old.
Because they capped off the top,
Mhm.
and they kept water from infiltrating from the top, which would ruin any building.
Yeah.
I think they've done a pretty good job of arresting its decay,
Yeah.
as they say.
Oh, come on.
I know, this won't give up.
Yeah. Yeah, it's surprising. You would expect it, I've worked on other ruins, and what typically happens is a wall is going to start to drift. You'll start to pick up some shear cracking, and then it accelerates, and no, I can't find.
But what we could do is go back and scan it 25 years
Yeah.
from now, and we can compare the data and see if it is drifting one way or the other. And then you can do some stabilization where it'll need it,
Yeah.
which is probably what they'll do.
And I make my living fixing buildings, so if I can't find something wrong with it, that's like all I do is look for things wrong, and I can't find it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's remarkably stable, I would say.
Could be because it's a smaller structure too,
Yeah,
that it's holding itself together.
and I'd love to know what the foundations look like because they didn't they must not have clipped corners down there.
Any more questions? All right, great. Thanks, fellas.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.